Those were the exact words I said to Karen Thompson, the HOA president, as she stood at my front door with her clipboard and her perfectly practiced scowl. Behind her, I could see her little entourage of neighborhood enforcers, all dressed like they were heading to a funeral instead of what was about to become the most legendary block party our street had ever seen. But let me back up, because this story isn't just about one party. This is about what happens when ordinary people decide they've had enough of petty tyrants who think a little bit of power makes them kings and queens of suburbia. This is about community, rebellion, and why sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to throw the biggest party of your life. It all started 3 months ago when I moved into 1247 Maple Street. Beautiful house, great neighborhood, friendly neighbors, or so I thought. The first red flag should have been the 47-page HOA handbook that arrived in my mailbox before I'd even finished unpacking. 47 pages. For a neighborhood. I've seen international peace treaties with fewer rules. But I'm a reasonable guy. I figured, hey, these people just want to keep property values up and maintain some standards. Boy, was I wrong. This wasn't about property values. This was about control, pure and simple. The first violation notice came exactly 2 weeks after I moved in. My crime. My garbage can was visible from the street for approximately 6 minutes past the designated pickup time. 6 minutes. I know this because Mrs. Henderson from across the street actually timed it and reported me. The fine? $50. I paid it, thinking it was just a one-time thing. Rookie mistake. Over the next month, the violations came fast and furious. My grass was half an inch too tall. Another $50. I had a package sitting on my porch for 3 hours, $75. My car was parked 2 inches over the edge of my driveway onto my own lawn, $100. But the final straw came when I got a violation for unauthorized outdoor decoration. My crime. A small American flag attached to my mailbox. Apparently, according to HOA Rule 23.7.b, all outdoor decorations must be pre-approved by the Aesthetic Standards Committee, which meets once a month and requires a written application submitted at least 14 days in advance. For an American flag, on my own property, that I own, that's when I realized this wasn't about maintaining standards. This was about a small group of people drunk on the tiniest amount of power, making life miserable for everyone else because they could. And that's when I decided to do something about it. I started talking to my neighbors, and what I discovered was shocking. I wasn't the only one being targeted. The HOA had become a machine designed to extract money from residents through petty violations and arbitrary rule enforcement. Mr. Johnson, who'd lived on the street for 30 years, had been fined $200 for having his Christmas lights up one day past the designated removal date, January 2nd. Sarah Martinez got hit with a $150 fine because her 7-year-old daughter drew on the sidewalk with chalk. The Patels were facing a $500 fine because their teenage son's friends sometimes parked on the street during his birthday party. But here's what really got me. I found out that Karen Thompson, our beloved HOA president, had somehow managed to avoid every single violation despite having the most obvious infractions on the entire street. Her grass was routinely longer than the approved height. Her garbage cans were permanently visible from the street. She had unauthorized decorations scattered across her property. When I dug deeper, I discovered why. Karen and her inner circle, 3 other board members, had been writing themselves exemptions for everything while ruthlessly targeting everyone else. They'd turned the HOA into their personal piggy bank and power trip rolled into one. That's when I came up with the idea for the party. But this wasn't going to be just any party. This was going to be a statement. A celebration of community over control. A giant middle finger to petty tyranny wrapped in the perfectly legal package of a neighborhood gathering. I spent 2 weeks researching every single HOA rule and city ordinance. I consulted with a lawyer friend who specialized in property law. I wanted to make sure that everything I did was not just legal, but bulletproof. Because I knew Karen and her crew would be looking for any excuse to shut me down. The party would be held on my property and the public street in front of my house. According to city ordinances, as long as I had the proper permits and didn't block through traffic, I was completely within my rights. The HOA had no authority over public streets, and they certainly couldn't prevent me from having guests on my own property. But here's where it gets interesting. I wasn't just planning a party. I was planning a revolution. I started with my immediate neighbors. Tom and Linda Wilson from next door were immediately on board. They'd been hit with so many frivolous violations that they were considering moving. The idea of fighting back instead of giving an appeal to them instantly. The Patels were next. When I explained my plan, Mr. Patel's eyes lit up. "You mean we can actually do something about these people?" he asked. "I thought we just had to take it." That's when I realized something important. Most people don't fight back against petty tyrants not because they can't, but because they don't think they're allowed to. They've been conditioned to believe that authority, no matter how small or illegitimate, must be obeyed without question. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood underground. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years were suddenly united by their shared frustration with the HOA's tactics. We had secret meetings in living rooms, coordinated through group texts, and planned like we were organizing a resistance movement. Because in a way we were. Getting the permits was surprisingly easy. The city clerk seemed genuinely amused when I explained what I was doing. "You're having a block party to protest your HOA?" she asked with a grin. "I wish more people would do that. Those organizations can get completely out of hand." She helped me navigate all the paperwork, made sure I had everything I needed, and even waived a few fees in the interest of community building. By the time I walked out of City Hall, I had official permission to use the public street, set up temporary structures, and have amplified music until 10 p.m. The preparations took on a life of their own. What started as my idea became a neighborhood-wide effort. The Johnsons offered to handle food coordination. The Martinez family volunteered to organize activities for kids. The Patel teenagers took charge of music and entertainment. But the real breakthrough came when Mrs. Chun, who lived 2 streets over, heard about our party through her friend Sarah Martinez. Mrs. Chun had been dealing with her own HOA nightmare for years. "Can we come?" she asked. "Our HOA is just as bad as yours, and we're tired of it too." That's when I realized this was bigger than just our street. This was about every person who'd ever been bullied by a petty official, every family who'd been targeted by arbitrary rule enforcement, every community member who'd been made to feel powerless by people drunk on the smallest amount of authority. Social media changed everything. Sarah Martinez's teenage daughter posted about the party on TikTok with the hashtag HOA party, and it went viral overnight. Local news stations picked up the story. The radio DJs started talking about it. Suddenly, people from all over the city were asking if they could come. I started getting messages from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. One family had been fined for having their garage door open for too long while they were moving furniture. Another couple got hit with violations for having guests park in their own driveway during a family reunion. A single mother was facing foreclosure because she couldn't afford the accumulated fines for violations like unauthorized outdoor furniture. A single plastic chair on her porch. The stories kept coming, and they all had the same theme. Small-minded people using arbitrary rules to make life miserable for their neighbors, all while exempting themselves from the same standards. About a week before the party, Karen Thompson and her board started their counterattack. I received a certified letter stating that the party violated HOA Covenant 15.3.a, which prohibited disruptive gatherings that interfere with the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood. I took the letter to my lawyer friend, who read it and started laughing. "This is completely unenforceable," he said. "They can't prevent you from having guests, and they have no authority over public property. If they try to interfere with your legally permitted event, they could face harassment charges." But Karen wasn't done. She started going door to door, trying to intimidate people into not attending. She told the Wilsons that participating in the party could result in additional violations. She warned the Patels that their son could be banned from neighborhood activities. She even tried to convince the Martinez family that the party was illegal and they could face legal consequences. Most people saw right through her tactics, but a few got scared and backed out. That's when I realized something important about bullies. They rely on fear and isolation to maintain their power. The moment people start standing together, the bully's power evaporates. The morning of the party, I woke up to find Karen Thompson standing in my front yard with a tape measure, clipboard, and camera. She was documenting every aspect of my setup, looking for violations. I walked outside with my coffee and said good morning. "This is highly irregular," she announced, as if I cared about her opinion. "The noise ordinance clearly states that amplified music is permitted until 10 p.m. with proper permits." I interrupted, holding up my official city documentation. "Which I have. Is there anything else I can help you with?" Her face turned red, but she couldn't argue with official city permits. She took a few more pictures and stormed off, muttering about consulting with legal counsel. By noon, the setup was complete. We had tables running down the middle of the street, a small stage for the local band that had volunteered to play, games for kids, and enough food to feed a small army. Everything was perfectly legal, properly permitted, and absolutely within our rights. The first guests started arriving around 1 p.m. My immediate neighbors, of course, but also people from other streets, other neighborhoods, other HOAs who'd heard about our rebellion and wanted to be part of it. By 2 p.m., we had over 100 people. By 3 p.m., it was close to 200. Local news crews showed up and started interviewing people about their HOA experiences. The stories they shared were incredible and incredibly similar to ours. But the real magic happened when people started connecting with each other. Neighbors who'd lived on the same street for years but had never really talked were suddenly sharing stories, laughing together, and realizing they had more in common than they'd ever imagined. At exactly 3:47 p.m., I remember the time because someone was recording it. Karen Thompson returned with her full board of directors and what appeared to be a security guard she'd hired for the occasion. They marched up to where I was standing near the main food table, looking like they were about to arrest someone for having too much fun. "This party is in violation of multiple HOA covenants," Karen announced loudly, clearly trying to intimidate people into leaving. "I'm ordering everyone to disperse immediately, or we'll be forced to take legal action." The crowd around us grew quiet, and I could feel everyone looking at me. This was the moment of truth. Would we back down in the face of her bluster, or would we stand our ground? I looked at Karen, then at the crowd of over 200 people who had come together to celebrate community over control. I thought about all the petty violations, all the arbitrary fines, all the neighbors who'd been too intimidated to fight back. And then I said the words that would become legendary in our neighborhood. "They tried to stop my party. Too late. Everyone's already here." The response was immediate and electric. People started laughing, clapping, and cheering. Someone started chanting, "Karen's got to go," and it spread through the crowd like wildfire. The local news cameras captured everything as our HOA president and her board stood there looking increasingly uncomfortable. But the best part wasn't the chanting or the cheering. The best part was what happened next. Tom Wilson, my quiet neighbor who'd never said a word against the HOA before, stepped forward and addressed Karen directly. "You know what, Karen?" he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "We're tired of your petty violations, your selective enforcement, and your power trips. This is our neighborhood too, and we have just as much right to enjoy it as you do." One by one, other neighbors stepped forward to share their stories. Mrs. Patel talked about the stress the HOA violations had caused her family. Mr. Johnson described how the arbitrary fines had made him consider selling the house he'd lived in for 30 years. Sarah Martinez explained how her daughter had been made to feel unwelcome in her own neighborhood. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The security guard Karen had hired, a middle-aged guy named Mike, had been listening to all the testimonies. Suddenly, he stepped away from Karen's group and walked over to where I was standing. "Hey," he said quietly, "I just want you to know that I live in a neighborhood with an HOA just like this one. My wife and I have been dealing with the same kind of harassment for years." He looked back at Karen, who was staring at him in shock. "I can't be part of shutting down something like this. You folks are doing something important here." He handed Karen back her money and walked away, leaving her and her board standing there without their hired intimidation. The crowd erupted in applause, and Mike became an instant hero. The local news coverage that night was incredible. The story wasn't just about a neighborhood party. It was about community resistance to petty tyranny. The reporter interviewed dozens of people, and their stories painted a clear picture of an HOA that had lost its way. But the real impact came from social media. Videos of the confrontation, particularly my "too late, everyone's already here" moment, went viral. Hashtag HOA party started trending locally, then regionally, then nationally. People from all over the country started sharing their own HOA horror stories. Within days, I was getting calls from reporters, legal experts, and even a few politicians who wanted to discuss HOA reform. What had started as a neighborhood block party had somehow become a symbol of grassroots resistance to arbitrary authority. The immediate aftermath was exactly what you'd expect. Karen and her board tried to retaliate with a flood of new violations against everyone who attended the party. But here's what they didn't count on. We were organized now, and we knew our rights. Every single violation was challenged. We had lawyers, we had documentation, and we had a neighborhood full of witnesses to their selective enforcement. Most importantly, we had momentum. The legal challenges revealed something that shouldn't have surprised anyone, but somehow did. The HOA had been operating outside its own bylaws for years. The board had been making up rules, imposing fines without proper procedures, and exempting themselves from the standards they imposed on everyone else. As we dug deeper into the HOA's finances and operations, the corruption became impossible to ignore. Karen Thompson had been approving landscaping contracts for her own company without disclosure. Board member Steve Richards had been waiving violations for his friends while strictly enforcing them against people he didn't like. The treasurer, Mary Foster, had been using HOA funds for personal expenses disguised as administrative costs. But the most shocking discovery was the selective enforcement database we found on Karen's computer during the legal discovery process. They had been literally keeping track of residents they liked versus residents they wanted to harass, with different enforcement standards for each group. The party had created something that hadn't existed before, a sense of community and shared purpose. We formed the Maple Street Neighborhood Alliance, with representatives from every household willing to participate. Our goal wasn't to eliminate the HOA. It served some legitimate purposes, but to reform it completely. We studied the bylaws, attended every board meeting, and started running candidates for the next election. Most importantly, we made sure that every resident understood their rights and knew they weren't alone in dealing with HOA overreach. The transformation was remarkable. People who had been afraid to put up holiday decorations were suddenly organizing community gardens. Families who had been isolated by HOA intimidation were hosting barbecues and game nights. Kids who had been scolded for playing in their own yards were organizing neighborhood-wide games of tag and hide-and-seek. The HOA board election 6 months later was unlike anything our neighborhood had ever seen. Instead of the usual handful of candidates running unopposed, we had contested races for every position. More importantly, we had informed voters who understood. What was at stake? The campaign was surprisingly civil. We focused on issues rather than personalities: transparent finances, consistent rule enforcement, community building rather than community policing. We held candidate forums in living rooms and backyards, giving everyone a chance to ask questions and understand where the candidates stood. Karen Thompson and her allies tried to run on a platform of maintaining standards, but it was hard to argue with the documented evidence of corruption and selective enforcement. When they couldn't defend their record, they resorted to fear-mongering about property values and undesirable elements moving into the neighborhood. It didn't work. The election results were decisive. Every single reform candidate won by margins of at least 60-40. Karen Thompson lost her bid for re-election by the largest margin in neighborhood history. The new board's first act was to establish clear, transparent procedures for everything from rule enforcement to financial management. We implemented an appeals process for violations, required disclosure of all conflicts of interest, and established regular community meetings where residents could voice concerns and suggestions. But more importantly, we changed the culture. Instead of looking for violations, the new HOA focused on building community. We organized quarterly neighborhood events, established a common area improvement fund, and created programs to help elderly residents with yard maintenance and home repairs. The transformation wasn't just administrative, it was social. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had characterized our neighborhood was replaced by cooperation and mutual support. Property values didn't suffer. They actually improved as people began taking pride in a community they felt part of rather than oppressed by. Our story inspired similar movements in neighborhoods across the city and beyond. The hashtag HOA Party hashtag became a rallying cry for community organizing and HOA reform. Legal experts started citing our case as an example of effective grassroots resistance to organizational overreach. More importantly, other neighborhoods started hosting their own parties and organizing their own reform movements. We began sharing resources, strategies, and legal templates with communities dealing with similar problems. What had started as one block party became a network of neighborhood democracy advocates. Looking back on the whole experience, I've learned some important lessons about power, community, and standing up to bullies. First, Bullies, whether they're individuals or organizations, rely on isolation and fear to maintain their power. The moment people start standing together and supporting each other, that power begins to crumble. Second, most people don't fight back not because they can't, but because they don't think they're allowed to. Understanding your rights and knowing that resistance is both legal and legitimate is the first step toward effective action. Third, documentation is everything. Keep records, take pictures, save correspondence. The people who abuse power usually do it systematically, and patterns of abuse are much harder to deny than individual incidents. Fourth, community organizing isn't just about fighting against something. It's about building something better. The most successful part of our movement wasn't just getting rid of bad leadership, but creating positive alternatives that served everyone's interests. 2 years later, our neighborhood is unrecognizable from what it was before the party. We have regular community events, active neighborhood committees, and a sense of shared ownership that extends far beyond property lines. Children play in the streets without fear of violations. Neighbors help each other with everything from snow removal to babysitting. We've become the kind of community that people move to rather than flee from. The HOA still exists, but it serves its intended purpose, maintaining common areas, coordinating community improvements, and providing a forum for neighbors to work together on shared concerns. It no longer operates as a mechanism for control and revenue generation through petty violations. Most importantly, we've created a culture of civic engagement that extends beyond HOA issues. Our residents are more involved in city council meetings, school board elections, and other local government activities. Once people learn they can make a difference in their immediate community, they often discover they can make a difference in the larger community as well. About a year after the party, I ran into Karen Thompson at the grocery store. I wasn't sure how the interaction would go. After all, our conflict had been very public and very personal. But when she saw me, something unexpected happened. She smiled. "You know," she said, "I was angry about that party for a long time. But I have to admit, the neighborhood is better now than it was when I was running things." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the people who abuse power aren't evil. They're just lost in systems that reward the wrong behaviors. When you change the system, you often change the people too. This story isn't really about HOAs or neighborhood politics. It's about what happens when ordinary people decide they've had enough of being pushed around by petty tyrants. It's about the power of community organizing, the importance of knowing your rights, and the difference that one person willing to take a stand can make. Every day, in communities across the country, people are dealing with similar situations. HOAs run amok, local officials drunk on small amounts of power, systems designed to benefit a few at the expense of everyone else. Most people suffer in silence, pay the fines, and hope someone else will solve the problem. But sometimes, someone decides to throw a party instead. And sometimes, that changes everything. The next time someone tries to push you around with arbitrary rules, selective enforcement, or petty power plays, remember this story. Remember that you have rights, you have allies, and you have the power to fight back. Most importantly, remember that the best way to resist tyranny, even petty tyranny, is often to build something better in its place. They tried to stop my party. Too late, everyone was already there. And once people come together, once they realize they're not alone, once they understand their own power, well, that's when the real party begins. Because in the end, that's what community is about. People choosing to stand together instead of suffering alone. People deciding to build something better instead of accepting something broken. People realizing that they don't have to be victims of other people's power trips. Sometimes all it takes is one party to change everything.